And welcome to On the Ledge podcast, and this week we're charming snakes. The plant kind. Greetings, listeners. My name is Jane Perrone. I'm the host of On the Ledge podcast, the houseplant podcast that takes you deep into the world of plants in your home. And in this week's episode, I'll be chatting about Sansevierias, aka the snake plant, those wonderful, tough succulents, with expert Dr. Colin Walker. And I'll be answering a question about repotting hesitancy. Ellen, Margot, Caroline. What unites these three people? They've earned themselves a place in my good books for becoming patrons of On the Ledge, and it is this band of more than 300 people who really help to keep the show alive. So thank you to those three new patrons this week. If you want to find out how to join them, just check the show notes, janeperrone.com. And thanks also to, I don't know how to pronounce this, is it Nan Katie did or Nankachi did? I don't know. Anyway, you're from the US and you wrote a lovely review for On the Ledge, so thank you to you. Snake plants, aka Sansevierias, are the Mr. T of the succulent world. Chunky, funky, and oh so tough. And they are something that I've been wanting to delve into on the Ledge for many a moon. And finally this week it's happening. I'm bringing back Dr. Colin Walker, President of the British Cactus and Succulent Society, biologist and expert on this genus, to talk all things snake plant. From propagation and pollination to that taxonomic controversy, we'll cover it all. The taxonomic controversy, I'll just preface that by saying that I'm still calling Sansevieria, despite the fact they've now been placed into the genus Dracaena following genetic research into their DNA. As we'll hear from Colin, it doesn't have to spoil our fun of this wonderful group of plants, which really do make a fabulous addition to anyone's houseplant collection. So, without further ado, let's get cracking and hear my chat with Dr. Colin Walker.
Well, hi folks, I'm Colin Walker. I'm currently president of the British Cactus and Succulent Society, but my 8-year presidency is just about to come to an end. I have been interested in growing and studying succulents for just over 50 years. I'm now retired, so I can spend more of my time looking after them, growing them and writing about them. I have a large collection in 2 greenhouses, a conservatory and a porch. I currently live in Scotland, just north of Glasgow, so the growing conditions are a bit challenging to what I was used to in Bedfordshire.
We're here to talk about Sansevierias, and this has been a subject that people have been requesting pretty much since day dot of making this podcast, and we're finally talking about them, devoting a whole episode to them. And these plants have grown hugely in popularity in the last few years. But I wonder whether you could start off by telling us a bit about where and how they grow in the wild and what conditions are like. I'm guessing they have to be tough because they're from a place where they're not getting much moisture.
Sansevierias, a genus of about 80 species, mainly distributed in Africa. Also, there's a couple in Madagascar. Then going east, they occur in Arabia, and as far east as Burma, there's a Sansevieria burmanica. I've only ever encountered Sansevierias in the wild once. We were on a safari in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, and there I encountered what I believe to be Sansevieria hyacinthoides. There are about 5 species native to South Africa, and this was growing in I would say, sort of grassland, really. So it wasn't a particularly arid environment. In fact, the Eastern Cape province is quite moist, to be honest. So the southern species don't really occur in particularly arid environments, but going north, so if you go northwest into Namibia, Angola, and then going northeast through Kenya up into the Arabian Peninsula, obviously conditions get more arid. They will grow in very arid environments there where the rainfall is very low. So they occur in quite a range of habitats. And they are tough. They are very tough plants, so they can survive extreme environments that are very dry, but also, some of them come from very moist environments as well. So that kind of relates to the way we grow them in cultivation. They're tough beasts.
I've seen division of, I don't know where I read this, that they can, I think actually it was in a book that I've got in electronic form only by an American writer called Hermine Stover. Does that name ring a bell? And I think it was in there that I read that she classifies them into soft leaf and hard leaf forms.
I would use a different sort of breakdown. I would call them, the soft-leaved ones, I would call them thin-leaved rather than soft-leaved. Because, to be honest, all Sansevierias have got tough leaves. And they're tough because they're full of fibres. And they have been used as a source of fibre commercially. It's called bowstring hemp. So the same way that agave sisal is used as a source of sisal, because agaves are very fibrous, Sansevierias have in the past been used as a source of bowstring hemp fibres. So all Sansevierias have tough fibrous leaves. But the kind of commonly encountered species, Trifasciata, it has a long, thin, strap-like leaf. It's not very succulent. It's quite thin, but it's very fibrous. So that's at the one end of the spectrum. The ones that I particularly like are at the other end of the spectrum, which have very fleshy leaves. They're still quite fibrous, but they're very succulent. So if you cut a section through some of these leaves, it's circular in section or deeply channeled. So they are very succulent. So that's kind of like a crude division. So the thin-leaved ones and the very fleshy, much more succulent-leaved ones. And in terms of succulent enthusiasts, it's the really succulent ones that are more interesting, and in some respects more challenging to grow because they tend to be slower growing.
And obviously they're very fibrous. Does that mean that not much actually eats them in their native homes? I'm thinking, I've got some phrase in my brain, God knows where it comes from, that is elephants chewing gum, which possibly indicates that elephants eat them, but I don't know where I'm getting that from.
I have no evidence for elephants eating Sansevierias. I've never read anything about that. And to be honest, I can't imagine elephants eating these things because they're quite tough and there's not much, the thin-leaved ones don't have much moisture in them. Elephants tend to like fleshy plants. They're renowned for eating baobabs, for instance, because they are very fleshy. So I can't imagine elephants eating them. To be honest, in terms of animals eating Sansevierias, I wouldn't have thought there's much danger of that. Certainly in cultivation, I find Sansevierias pest-free, to be honest. I mean, my cacti and Crassulaceae are quite prone to mealybugs. I mean, that's a common pest of succulents. They don't seem to attack Sansevierias, so in terms of pests and diseases, Sansevierias are pretty trouble-free in my experience.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever had a pest on any of mine. I can't recall having one. I mean, I'm sure there's somebody somewhere with a Sansevieria with mealybugs. Interestingly, these plants are often classified as unkillable, but I'm often a bit concerned that people suggest putting them into, they're very good in deep shade, which seems counterintuitive to me, given where they come from and that they are succulent plants. If you actually want your Sansevieria to really grow and thrive, what are the best conditions for it?
I have only ever killed Sansevierias when accidentally they'd been in it wasn't accidentally. They were in a greenhouse and accidentally the greenhouse heating failed. So I had no heating for about 5 days in a greenhouse, and I lost only 6 Sansevierias. They were completely killed, so they got frosted. So the first point is Sansevierias make ideal houseplants. They love warm conditions. So I have virtually no Sansevierias in my greenhouses. All my Sansevierias are either in the house as houseplants or in the conservatory. And I guess nowhere does the temperature ever drop below 12 degrees? And obviously higher temperatures are good, so they love centrally heated rooms. So that's the first point. Higher temperatures. They do not like low temperatures. And they do need light. They're plants, so they need light. But they are tolerant of low light conditions, but they won't grow as well. So they will survive shade, but they won't grow so well, and they probably wouldn't flower. So I have most of mine in a conservatory that's got a plastic roof. So it is dappled light, but there's a lot of good light. But it's not full sunlight, I would say. Really strong sunlight could damage them, I suspect, but I've never had that trouble either. So grown as houseplants, I would advise give them as much light as possible. Sunny, south-facing windowsills are probably best if you've only got windowsills. Conservatory, they make perfect conservatory plants so long as you heat the conservatory during the winter. So, as good a light as you can give them, warm temperatures, and now when it comes to watering, this varies a lot depending on the conditions. I grow mine in a mixture of 2 parts John Innes, 1 part grit, so it's fairly free draining. And I water all my Sansevierias modestly once a week all the year round, so I don't stop in the winter. My friend Gordon Rowley, who's no longer with us, used to grow his on the windowsill, and he used to have saucers under his pots, and he used to keep water in the saucers 24/7. So for a lot of Sansevierias, they can take a lot of water, but it does depend on having a really free draining compost. If you just use John Innes or one of these standard horticultural mixers with no grit or added drainage, they can rot off if you give them too much water. And to be honest, a lot of houseplant growers do tend to overwater. So I guess my advice is modest water once a week if you're growing them as houseplants. And they thrive under those conditions. But the other side of the coin is they can thrive on neglect. You can go away and leave a Sansevieria for a month. If you go off on a summer holiday and you're away for 3 or 4 weeks, you can leave them with no water and they will be fine when you come back. So they do thrive on neglect, but they do survive on neglect, but they do thrive with a bit, or shall we say minimum, TLC.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about the potting mix. I think that lots of people buy these plants and the way they come often from the Dutch nurseries is in a mix that's fine for them in the Dutch nursery, but when you get them home is just too moisture retaining. So it is. I always sort of say to people, well, have you repotted it yet? Because I think that mix, if you water generously, just keeps too much moisture around those roots. And they are quite amazing, the roots of Sansevierias. I don't know if all of them are orange, but I certainly know that a couple I've repotted recently have had lovely orange roots, which was kind of interesting.
It's not just a root system, it's an underground stem for most of them. So what you're describing as being orange isn't actually the root, it's the underground stem. So they have some very thick underground stems called rhizomes. It's a bit like an iris, to be honest. Most of the stem is actually buried underground, and what you're saying is orange is actually the stem. And some of them need a lot of space for that. I got a plant that was collected in Tanzania last year, and the leaves are about 10, 12 centimetres long, but the plant, because it's got this big, thick, chunky underground rhizome, needed a pot that's, a good 15 centimetres tall. So most of the plant it's like an iceberg. It's underground. You can actually use that to propagate them. So I guess we'll come on to propagation later on, but we're talking about roots at the moment. So those underground stems, you can take sections of those, chop them up, take sections and plant them, and they will, send out shoots. The other thing while we're talking about roots and potting compost is quite a lot of Sansevierias don't like being disturbed. They don't like their root system disturbed. So what I tend to do is leave them alone in the pot until they're absolutely pot bound and then repot them. Because it can take several months for them to kind of establish in their new pot when you've repotted them.
That's an interesting point. And I've had the experience of finding a plant that's been inside a plastic pot and then in a cash pot, and I've lifted out the inner pot and discovered that it's literally busting out of the inner pot because they're just so they get so huge. And I guess that's the secret to their success of being able to be very tough, and they're storing a lot of water and nutrients in that rhizome.
I tend not to use plastic pots very much for Sansevierias because I'm growing them indoors, so I want them in attractive pots. But I have occasionally had plants burst through a plastic pot because there's so much underground growth. Yeah, they'll burst through. Absolutely, yeah.
And there are loads of different Sansevieria species on the market now. Absolutely loads of them. I mean, I was just looking at some pictures recently of the whale fin Sansevieria masoniana, where they're selling them with etchings of, like, they've somehow marked the leaves to make a picture on the side of the leaf. Did I send you a picture of that?
Yes, I hadn't seen that before, so thank you for that. It's like, these garden centres that sell cacti with dried flowers stuck into them. It's not natural, is it? I hate that kind of thing.
No, it's very strange. I don't understand what the rationale is, but I guess they're selling plants, somebody's buying them. There are so many different species that are popular now, and also I know you're not keen on variegation, but the variegated forms are popular. I recently got hold of my dream Sansevieria, which is Bantel's Sensation. I've been reading up on it, that it's actually quite hard to grow for a Sansevieria, but so far so good on that one. Do you have to be careful if you're trying to propagate a variegated one? Will it grow true from a rhizome division? Will the variegation stay?
Right. Okay. If you want to talk about propagation, just generally, there's four main ways of propagating Sansevieria. So the slowest process is growing from seed. I have never done that, to be honest, and seed isn't very readily available. So, that's kind of a specialist way to propagate Sansevierias. Then the easiest way is to take cuttings. So some plants, like Sansevieria parva, form very large clumps, and you can just take offsets, cuttings. Parva is one that produces overground stolons. So it sends shoots along the soil surface, and you can just take one of those shoots and they'll reroot quite quickly. So dry off the cut surface for a few days and pop it into some compost, and that will take quite easy. So we've already talked about the underground stems, the rhizomes, so you can just take sections of those and again dry them off before you put them into compost, and they will root and shoot. And the final quite easy way, although it's quite a slow process, is to take leaf cuttings. So Sansevierias come beautifully from leaves. You can take a leaf of one of the really succulent ones like Cylindrica. So you could have a leaf that maybe is 30 or 40 centimetres long. You could actually chop that up into half a dozen bits, and each bit will root. But it's quite slow. Sometimes it takes 6 months, even a year, for a leaf cutting to root, and maybe even another 6 months before it will send out shoots. But eventually we'll get shoots from these leaf cuttings, and I have had virtually zero failure rate with that. Right. Now, the question you asked me was about the variegates. Now, that is slightly tricky. Variegation is quite a complex process because you've got different layers with different cells. And quite often what happens if you take a cutting off a variegated Sansevieria, it's the lean part that will send out shoots and the variegate doesn't. So if you've got a variegated Sansevieria, really you shouldn't be trying to propagate it from a leaf. You need to take it from a shoot. Or if it's got underground rhizomes, you can take sections of that which will root. So a variegated Sansevieria will propagate from an underground rhizome, and you will keep the variegation.
Yes, so I've seen this, people do this. I've not tried it myself because it always seems very much simpler just to divide a plant and make those rhizome divisions. That just seems obvious. But I have seen lots of people on Instagram do this where they get sections of leaf and root it. And I always think, well, why are you bothering with that variegated plant? Because then you look at the cutting they've ended up with, or the young plant they've ended up with, and it's the shoots are coming from the green section, and you just got a plain green leaf, which presumably isn't, well, I guess perhaps that's preferable if you're not into variegation, but it just seems like, I don't know, I'm not sure why people bother with them, with the leaf cuttings. As you say, you're going to lose the variegation, and it's very slow.
Really, I would say don't bother with a variegated Sansevieria trying to propagate from leaves. It's not really the way to do it. It's my opinion anyway.
If you want to hone some new skills this spring, check out Learning with Experts, the global classroom community that brings people together to learn from the best in the business. Their range of courses covers everything from food and drink to photography and gardening. So, why not become an accredited garden designer and learn with world-renowned experts including influential Dutch garden designer P. Doolhof and multi-award-winning British designer Tom Stewart Smith? Or take a course on herb gardening, natural beekeeping, or growing veg. You can start whenever it suits, and you get to meet other gardening enthusiasts in the sociable online classroom. Visit learningwithexperts.com/on the ledge now for 10% off your first course. That's learningwithexperts.com/on the ledge. Learning with Experts, online learning that's guaranteed to lift the spirits. Are there any variegated Sansevieria that you do like? I know you're not a great fan, but are there any that you'll make an exception for?
Bantel's Sensation, I love that. Yes, that. And I've got one or two Trifasciata harnii variegates, and I've got a variegated parva, but that's about it. I've got a few hybrids. Now, the hybrids are a different matter. I've named one Sansevieria IKEA because a friend bought it from IKEA without a name, so I've called it Sansevieria IKEA. That's one of the thin-leaved forms, but I love that because it flowers annually. It really is a good grower. There's another one very similar called Punky. I think both of these probably originated from an old hybrid called Fernwood. I don't know what the parents are, but this is a very thin, long-leaved form, but they flower very well. So we'll come on to flowering a bit later, I suppose, but they are great for flowering. And I've just got a new hybrid, which is Phillipsy, cross with Pinguicula. That's going to be quite slow growing, so I'll see how that does. So I'm more into the hybrids rather than the variegates, I have to say, in terms of Sansevierias.
Let's come on to the flowers, because you did mention them there. I have not had any of mine flower. I'm very, very disappointed. Can you tell me how I get mine to flower? I mean, I've got a few different species.
I've grown Sansevierias for over 20 years, and I guess I've flowered 30 or 40 different ones. There's no quick fix to getting them to flower. It's choosing the right plants, I would say. So I think they will all flower, but it can take time. So some need to be very large to flower, and some will flower quite small and flower regularly. So my advice, if you want flowers, is choose the right flowering species or cultivars. So I've mentioned punky, I've mentioned Ikea, fernwood. They all flower for me annually. And one of the best ones for flowering is Sansevieria francisi. It's quite small growing. It has leaves in 5 tiers, but I have it in flower every year. So that's a good one for flowers. The other side of the coin is Trifasciata, which I've only ever flowered once. You see quite often very large plants of Trifasciata, and they don't flower very often. So if you want flowers, that is absolutely one not to go for. So it's not a question of any particular trick to getting them to flower. It's growing the right plants that will flower when they're small and will flower annually.
And is it worth the wait?
Oh, absolutely. Sansevieria flowers are beautiful. There are 2 groups of Sansevierias when it comes to flowering. Most of them have tall spikes. Some of them have spikes, up to 1 metre tall. The really big ones have large branch spikes, which can be 1.5, 2 metres tall. The other group produce their inflorescence underground, so the flowers emerge at soil level. The only one I flowered in that small group is Hawley, and that only flowered once, but the flowers were magnificent. All Sansevierias are night flowering, so the flowers open late afternoon, and each flower only lasts 1 night, and they produce the most gorgeous, beautiful scents, hyacinth-like I would describe them as. And if you have a flower spike that has 20, 30 flowers open in a night, you come down in the next morning and the room is full of this absolutely gorgeous scent. But each flower only lasts 1 night. But if you've got a flower spike with, up to 100 buds on it, you could have flowers over a course of a week, say. They have this scent because they attract moths. They're pollinated by moths, so that's why most of them don't have much colour. Some of them have a tinge of pink. There's one brown one, but most of them are white. Moths are attracted by the scent and not by the colour. So, that's why they're scented, to attract the pollinators, which are moths.
I'm glad it's worth the wait. Well, I'm glad you like Bantel Sensation, because I was searching for it so long. And I mean, mine is a rhizome division, so it has about 4 leaves right now. But I was panicking because lots of people said, it's quite difficult. And I heard from other people who had a piece of rhizome and some leaves, and they were struggling. But mine seems to be doing okay.
It's slow growing, so you just need patience.
I've never done this, but I've always fancied having some kind of mixed Sansevieria trough or dish or large pot arrangement with various different species and hybrids of different heights, shapes and colours. Is that a good idea, or is it better to keep them in individual pots?
I've only ever done it once. I had, when I was working, there was a planter in a corridor which had nothing in it. It was, a metre and a half long trough, and it was empty, so I purloined it, and I planted 3 plants in it. I had Zamioculcas, of which I know you're very fond of. I had a dragon tree, Dracaena draco, and the third plant was a very large plant of Sansevieria fisheri, which is a very attractive cylindrical leaved Sansevieria. And that was a mixed planting, that worked very well. I had a very well-drained compost, and they thrived. So I have never done any other mixed planting with Sansevierias, but I see no reason why not. If you're putting them in a trough, which is what I did, with no holes in the bottom, you just need to be very careful with the watering. So a very free-draining compost. If it was a large trough like I used, I think I put pebbles in the bottom and top dressed with grit. So yeah, I see no reason why not. Try it and see. There's all sorts of containers available. But if it's a container that doesn't have holes in the bottom, you have to be very, very careful. Go easy on the watering. Or most of my Sansevierias are grown in glazed ceramic or terracotta pots, and they've all got holes in the bottom. So if I get a charity shop pot that I rather like that doesn't have holes, I drill holes in the bottom to make sure it's free draining.
And do you just match that with a saucer of some kind to catch the drips?
It depends where the plant's sitting. If it's just on the conservatory floor, it's not so critical. But obviously, if it's on a windowsill... windowsills, I've quite often got plastic trays. So the rather attractive glazed pots are sitting on a plastic rectangular tray to catch the water, yeah. So I don't get in trouble with my better half for letting water dribble off the windowsill. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Dracaena there, which brings us on to the slightly controversial issue of the taxonomy of Sansevieria, because I don't know who's in charge of this, but some taxonomist somewhere has decided that Sansevieria is actually in the genus Dracaena. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to get used to that. But I mean, when you say Dracaena, I think of things like Dracaena marginata and the corn plant, Dracaena fragrans, and they don't seem that similar. Can we just ignore this taxonomic change, or is it something very important that we need to all be sort of switching our language on?
The background to this is this group of plants, we're talking about nearly 200 species now, if you put the two together. So Dracaena, the dragon tree genus, and Sansevieria. As with a lot of plant families, genera, a lot of molecular work has been done comparing gene sequences. And just to simplify the story here, what has been discovered is that Sansevieria is not, from its genes, significantly different from Dracaena, and all Sansevierias on that basis have been transferred to Dracaena. So every Sansevieria has now a new name or the same species name, but has now been transferred to Dracaena. That is based on gene sequencing comparisons, and this is happening all the time in lots of different plant groups. If you think about it, the 200 species that we end up with in Dracaena are not that divergent, to be honest. There's a wide range of forms, but it's not as vast as some other genera. So Euphorbia, let's just quickly compare it to Euphorbia. Euphorbia is a huge genus. It's got 2,000 species. And Euphorbia ranges from tiny little geophytic plants to great huge trees. And that has expanded recently because a few small genera have been shown to be not distinct on the molecular basis. So the evidence is quite strong that Sansevieria and Dracaena are one in the same genus, and they all have names in Dracaena. Now, there aren't taxonomic police around here, so if you want to still call them Sansevierias, you can. And to be honest, although as a scientist I accept this new classification, I still call them Sansevierias. I'm a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde character here. So I've accepted splits from aloe, for instance. So there are several small genera that have been broken away from aloe. So there's Aloedendron, Aloe ampelos, Kumara. So I'm readily adopted that. But to be honest, I'm a bit of an old stickler here, and I still call my Sansevierias Sansevieria. And, you know, the rest of the planet can still call them Sansevierias if they so want. The Sansevieria Dracaena police are not going to come away and throw all your plants in the bin because you've got them wrongly named. It's only significant, really, if it comes to shows. So if you had a class that said Dracaena, the show committee or the judge has got to be careful to make sure that they don't NAS, i.e. not to schedule, a Sansevieria that has been put in a Dracaena class or vice versa. So that's the only, in terms of horticulture, that's the only significant place it's important. So I, for one, at least at the moment, are quite happy to call them Sansevierias.
It does seem to raise emotions on. I'm looking on various Sansevieria forums and Facebook groups, and there's some very strong opinions out there. But I mean, I'm like you. I'm just going to accept that the taxonomy is correct. But I guess, you know, like a lot of plants where the genus has changed over the years, we kind of adopt the old genus name almost as a common name.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are big controversies. I mean, the Sansevieria world is quite small, really. A big controversy raged over acacia. So, acacia was split up, again, on the basis of molecular studies, and that was incredibly controversial. So some of these changes are widely adopted quite quickly, and others, there's a lot of inertia, and people want to stick with what they're used to. And as I say, apart from issues on the show bench, it to be honest, doesn't really matter. As a scientist, I have to say, though, I do accept that Sansevieria is now part of Dracaena. But as a horticulturalist, I still call them Sansevierias. So there you go. That's me being truly Jekyll and Hyde.
I've just thought of a question which I forgot to ask you when we were talking about roots. Is there a reason why that rhizome is orange? Does that serve any useful purpose to the plant?
Pass. I've no idea. I don't. That's a very interesting question, Jane. Why is a Sansevieria rhizome orange? And I'm afraid I haven't a clue. Obviously, there must be some pigment in there, but what? I don't know. I have no idea. I'm sorry. You've got me on that one.
We may never know, but perhaps somebody will have an answer and suggest something.
To be honest, in science, there are far more questions that don't have answers than questions that do have answers. That's the fascination of science for me, to be honest.
Yeah, indeed. And there's one thing I wanted to ask you, which has been a question in my mind for a long time. And it concerns that actually the Sansevieria that's on my podcast logo, which is, I think, goes by various common names, including witch's fingers, Sansevieria cylindrica. And this species and various other cylindrical leaved species and hybrids seem to cause people a lot of problems because they buy the plants, and oftentimes they seem to be leaf cuttings that have been rooted and shoved in the pot, sometimes in a different shape than would be natural. And people discover they haven't actually got a plant, they've got a selection of leaf cuttings. And then also, when new leaves start to grow, the Sansevieria cylindrica leaves aren't cylindrical when they first come out, which really throws people that they've got a different plant. But I'm presuming that it's just that the leaves start out one shape and mature into that cylinder. Am I right?
Quite a lot of Sansevierias have two rather different growth forms. So I mentioned earlier Sansevieria fisheri. This is the classic. So fisheri has two distinct growth forms. So its juvenile form is a flat rosette. So these are flattish, thinnish leaves, a flat rosette. As it matures, it produces upright, vertical, cylindrical leaves, and that's the adult form. Okay? So I've got a clump that has grown from a leaf. So I've taken a cylindrical leaf, I've rooted it, and it's produced shoots. This has taken about 3 years to produce a clump, 8 centimetres across. So we've got a cylindrical leaf that's rooted, and around it, it's got 3 or 4 flattish rosettes. So that's standard growth form for quite a lot of Sansevierias. And the one you're talking about, cylindrica, isn't quite the same, but it's similar. I've got the plant sitting next to me now on my desk, and I have done the same with that. So I've got a leaf cutting that's 25 centimetres long. It rooted, it's taken about 2 years, and it's got lots of new shoots at the base. The early ones are channelled. They are thin. So what people are seeing is the young, immature stage. And if you keep it long enough, let it grow, they will all develop the typical cylindrical leaf. If you buy one of these pots from a garden centre that's got half a dozen separate leaves, what I would advise you to do is pot them all up separately. So you've got 6 separate plants and just leave them to grow. And eventually you will get clumps which will just have the cylindrical leaf. It will take several years because it's not a fast grower, but in time it will. So yeah, I do object to garden centres or nurseries doing that, because you buy a plant that looks okay, but it isn't actually a proper rosette. When you depot it, as you say, you've got half a dozen separate plants. So they shouldn't be doing that. But they do that because they get a plant that they can sell quicker.
Yeah, and it happens with other species as well. You know, you often see it with tropical plants where they put lots of seedlings in the pot. So you think it's one plant, but it's actually lots of seedlings which then outcompete each other, and you've got a problem. But yeah, it's one of those things, I guess. It's intriguing, and at least if you know about it, you can solve the problem. But yeah, I suspect when you have all those root cuttings in a pot, it's not necessarily going to lead you to ultimate success with that plant.
Well, it will if you just have to have patience, Jane, because it's not a fast-growing species. So cylindrica is a big-growing plant. I mean, it can have leaves a metre and a half long. So what I've got here is a very young plant, but just have patience and you'll get there eventually.
I think with Sansevieria, that is the key. They are quite slow growing.
The hybrids I talked about, Ikea, Punky, Fernwood, they are fast growing. I got a single cutting, and within 2 years, I've got a 15 centimetre pot full of it, and it also sends out above ground stolons. So, some of them are fast growing. So you've got a range. The slowest growing plant I've got is Sansevieria fisteri. It has big, thick, chunky leaves. I was given that plant 20 years ago, and it is still only in a 12 centimetre pot. And goodness knows when I'll get to that, get to see that in flower. So some are very fast growing and some are exceptionally slow growing. And that's the interest, isn't it? If they all did the same thing, wouldn't life be a bit boring,
Exactly. We haven't talked about feeding. I guess it's the same rule as with other cacti and succulents, that you don't want to overfeed.
Yeah, I feed everything during the spring, summer and autumn once a fortnight. I use Chempac 3 usually. So yeah, my Sansevierias get fed moderately throughout spring, summer and early autumn. I tend to stop feeding them in the winter. So although I keep watering them, I tend not to feed them. So yeah, it's just the standard feeding regime for any cacti and succulents. There's nothing special about Sansevierias in that school.
Marvellous. Well, I'm sure that I will be adding further to my Sansevieria collection. They're all on a round coffee table, and I'm thinking, only 2/3 of the coffee table's covered right now. I've got more room to add some more. So yes, I just keep sneaking them in and hope that my husband doesn't notice.
Well, I'm going to send you some photographs so people can view some of my images on your website. I think I've got 3 or 4 of flowers, and so I've got about 15 photographs I've selected for you.
Fantastic. Well, they will be a really great addition to the show notes. So, yes, I would encourage listeners to go and check those out and have a look at the plants that we've been talking about. Thank you very much, Colin.
Okay, you're very welcome. Great to speak with you.
Thank you to Dr Colin Walker for joining me to talk about snake plants. And I've come out into the garden to answer this week's question of the week because, well, it's rather hot today and I fancy a sniff of my roses. Wow, yes, this is a beautiful pink rose. Definitely not a houseplant, but it smells absolutely gorgeous. And if you look at my Instagram, I've done a reel of some of the roses in my garden if you want to check them out. But let's turn to the question. I'm just going to plonk myself on the grass here and get into it. And it comes from Eliza, who says that despite a love for ferns, I suppose like most humans, I am a fern killer. Well, me too. I've killed a fair few ferns in my time, but Eliza has one fern that has been in her possession for 3 years and is still alive and doing reasonably well, Eliza writes. In fact, it's a monster. And looking at the pictures, yep, I can see that is true. It's enormous. Not so much of a fern killer after all. Oh, look, Wolfie. Hi, Wolfie. Wolfie's just come up for a cuddle and some sunbathing. Hi, Wolfie. In case you're new to the show, Wolfie is my lurcher and the show mascot and a very good dog. Right, okay, sorry Eliza, getting distracted here. So, Eliza wants to know what to do about repotting this large fern. And she's worried that basically it's a bit of a monster and she's not sure where to start and what she can do. Now, I would say, looking at this fern, that it's in the prime of life. It's doing well. I think it's a pteris, which is Pteris genus. I suspect it is Pteris cretica, and this is one of the easiest ferns to keep, so that's good news for you, Eliza. I think it's one of the toughest ferns there is, and I would say the main thing to say is don't worry too much about repotting it. Assuming that you're in the Northern Hemisphere and it's spring/early summer, now is a really good time to tackle this task. And with a big plant like this, yes, repotting it may cause a temporary setback, but the plant is big enough and strong enough to deal with that shock and will actually benefit from a repot. Eliza's got a self-watering device, a yellow bottle stuck in the top, which is providing water, which is a great idea for ferns. Any kind of self-watering really works because it keeps the moisture steady, which is what they love. As you'll remember if you listened to the plant rescuer episode last week, episode 186. So I would say, how do you know when to repot this plant? Well, you're obviously considering it, which must mean you've seen perhaps some kind of signs that the plant is, well, maybe getting too big for its pot. Maybe, well, it looks like you've got some roots coming out of the top, and generally the pot looks rather small in comparison to the size of the plant. I think you're just going to have to go in there and take the pot off. You may need to cut it away. With a big plant like that, with all those roots pouring out the top, it may be difficult to dislodge. So be prepared to get in there with a pair of really substantial scissors and cut away the pot. Obviously, in an ideal world, it's good to avoid cutting the pot so that you can reuse it. Assuming it's plastic, you want to get as many uses as possible out of a plastic pot. In sustainability terms, I grow a lot of my plants in plastic pots and they get reused time after time after time. I never buy plastic pots. I either reuse ones I've already got or I ask around and somebody's always got some to donate. So I think you can get it out of that pot and assess what's going on. I would take that opportunity to maybe trim some of the more wayward roots. Again, the plant will be able to cope with this. It's got a lot of roots there and it's got a good set of foliage on it. So don't worry too much about taking off some of those roots if you just find you're struggling. So, yeah, take it out of the pot, have a look. If you've got a situation where you've got a very matted root ball, and it's very hard to see what's going on, again, don't be afraid to get a serrated knife or a pruning saw and just cut across the bottom. It sounds really brutal, but sometimes it can be really helpful, because if you've got a situation where the roots are all matted and there's no way for those roots to escape out into the new compost, you've got a problem on your hands in that they may just start circling around that root ball and may not establish well in the new pot. But I would say, assuming that that's not the case, tease out some of those roots so they're going in the right direction into that new compost, and put it into a slightly larger pot. Again, if you're trimming roots, think about balance. So making sure that if you trim some roots, you're also trimming a bit of foliage. That means the plant's kind of got a balance between the root system and the foliage that it has to support. But I reckon go for it. Ferns like reasonably moisture retentive potting mix. So I would do something like A regular houseplant potting mix, peat free if you possibly can, as I always say on the show, and you could add a bit of vermiculite to that. You could add some fine orchid bark, you could add some activated charcoal. If you are using a self-watering system of some kind, then you may want to make the drainage a bit more sharp, so rather than vermiculite you might be putting something like perlite in there. But this fern looks like it's doing really well. Don't panic. Have confidence and give it a whirl. Even if it goes wrong, the plant will be fine. I have confidence in this one. I think you're going to be doing well, Eliza, and you have done well, so take comfort. The other thing to say is if you don't repot it, what's going to happen? Well, if you decide not to repot, I would just watch out for signs of decline in the plant. If you find that the plant is starting to look really miserable, then it could be the plant is just not able to get enough resources out of the substrate that it's in, and then you really do need to take action. Better to do it now in early summer when the plant is still in active growth, as opposed to waiting for an emergency in the autumn when repotting, it may carry slightly more risks. I hope that helps, Eliza, and gives you some inspiration for your fern. And you say at the end, love your podcast, but my husband blames you for transferring one of our rooms into a plant room. Okay, complaints can be filed to the following email address, ontheledgepodcast@gmail.com. Yes, you can point all of your relatives in my direction to moan about this amount of space that your houseplant collection is taking up. And if you've got a question for On the Ledge, you can also use the same email address. Be like Eliza and include lots of information and some pictures, because that helps me no end. Right, back inside, Wolfie. You can stay and sunbathe. That's all for this week's show. Thanks for joining me this week, and I'll see you again in 7 days' time. Bye! The music you heard in this episode was Roll Jordan Roll by the Joy Drops, The Road We Used to Travel When We Were Young by Komiku, and Namaste by Jason Shaw. The ad music was Dill Pickles by the Heftone Banjo Orchestra. All tracks are licensed under Creative Commons. Visit the show notes for details.